Welcome to the Southern Almanac, the weekly show from the Institute of Southern Studies Take on the South podcast. Each week, we look at the South from A to Z, examining some Southern thing from a variety of angles. The show is curated by yours truly, Matt Simmons, the Assistant Director of the Institute and the producer of the podcast. Today, we come to the letter B. B is for bourbon. Bourbon. The word evokes so much in just 7 little letters. Without bourbon, the great Scotch whiskey tradition as we know it wouldn't exist, because the modern version of that great old world distilling tradition depends on using the spent barrels of its younger cousin. The word itself refers to a beverage, elite conservative Democrats in the post-Reconstruction South, and a county in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. A distilling tradition with roots in Virginia crosses the Appalachians in the early days of the Republic, thus connecting the South and the West, reminding us that the original American West, Kentucky and Tennessee, is inescapably Southern. And yet bourbon, so often used as a generic term for American whiskey, has a tightly controlled definition. And Tennessee and Kentucky have similar yet nevertheless divergent distilling traditions. Rest assured, Kentucky bourbon ain't Tennessee whiskey, and Tennessee whiskey ain't Kentucky bourbon. So let's just get right to it. What actually is bourbon? The Kentucky Encyclopedia gives us a straightforward enough definition. Bourbon is made from fermented mash containing at least 51% corn and lesser amounts of wheat, rye, and barley, along with yeast and distilled limestone water. It is distilled at no more than 160 proof and aged in charred oak barrels, a process that gives the bourbon its reddish color and unique taste. And in that same entry from the Kentucky Encyclopedia, we're told that bourbon's origins in the Commonwealth of Kentucky go back to at least 1775, when the first corn crops were harvested in Kentucky. The name for the whiskey is likely from Bourbon County, Kentucky, which was established in 1785 and was the location of the lion's share of early distillers of that spirit. By the middle of the 19th century, the name bourbon seems to have become tightly associated with the corn-based whiskey produced so magnificently there in the bluegrass, and used as a means to distinguish it from the rye whiskeys of western Pennsylvania. The connections to Pennsylvania, and with it the trans-Appalachian story of the South, the ways in which North and South have always danced a delicate dance over ideas of America, are apparent in the history and even in every glass of bourbon. There's also that whole whiskey rebellion thing. It's echoes in Appalachia and the South, and how that connects NASCAR and pop cultural presentations of the South, like the Dukes of Hazzard and so on and so forth. But all that's for another time. This dance between bourbon as a Kentucky thing, a Southern thing, and a more generally American phenomenon is all the more apparent when we consider that, technically, bourbon doesn't have to be made in Kentucky. Per federal law, all a spirit needs to call itself bourbon is to be made in America, meet the requirements for mash bill, limestone water, aging, and distilled strength. Technically, you could make bourbon in Idaho, but it probably wouldn't go all that well. Kentucky bourbon is so wonderful and so renowned because of that most southern characteristic, place. Kentucky's climate, its water, soil, and all these go together to make the best bourbon. To drink it is to taste Kentucky and to taste history, place, and people of that beautiful Commonwealth. What about down in Tennessee? What is their whiskey? Well, in all ways it meets the criteria of being called bourbon, but you better not let a Tennessean hear you call it bourbon. Whiskey, like barbecue, is a Southern thing over which we will fight one another, with each of us holding tightly onto regional and sub-regional distinctivenesses, in which state pride and the lives we have lived, the lives we saw our grandparents live, in which all of these and more are on the line. So don't go calling Tennessee whiskey bourbon, because even if it is, it also ain't. Tennessee whiskey must be produced to the same standards as bourbon, but it must also go through an additional step, known as the Lincoln County process, in which the whiskey must be filtered through maple charcoal before aging. This creates a distinctive and instantly recognizable flavor. Line up a glass of good Kentucky bourbon next to a good Tennessee whiskey. Taste both, and while you may like one more than the other, or you might even like them equally well, you'll walk away recognizing the difference. The most popular Tennessee whiskey, and by some measures, the most popular whiskey on the planet, is Jack Daniel's No. 7 in its iconic square bottle. But the story behind that whiskey is yet another example of the complexity and vibrancy of the Southern story. While Jasper Newton Daniel may have his name on the bottle, he learned his craft from a man named Nearest Green. Born into slavery, Green was owned not by a single individual, but by a business firm, a not uncommon arrangement in American chattel slavery that we often fail to remember in our stories of that tragic time in our history. In the early 1850s, Green was leased out to a farmer, preacher, and distiller named Dan Call. According to CBS News, when, sometime later, in the late 1850s, quote, Jack Daniel, an orphan, started working for Call. The distiller teamed Daniel, quote, up with Green, one of his slaves and his main whiskey man. According to the author Fawn Weaver, after emancipation, Daniel, quote, started his own company, and the person he went to first was his mentor, and he did not see race as a barrier. Green was thus the first master distiller of Jack Daniels, and is mentioned some 50 times in the 1967 biography of Daniel, Jack Daniel's Legacy, by Ben A. Green, who is no relation to Nearest. In recent years, the aforementioned Fawn Weaver has sought to popularize the story of Nearest Green, and has launched the Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey brand, produced by the Nearest Green Distillery in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Shelbyville, Tennessee also happens to be the home of the Musgrave Pencil Company, the makers of the finest pencils on the planet. That's just my opinion, but I'm right. Down the road a ways from Shelbyville, up in north-central Tennessee, is the gorgeous little town of Granville, the home of Albert Gore Sr., father of the former vice president and progressive icon Al Gore, as well as one of the more charming little museums in the South, the Whiskey Decanter Museum. Sitting proudly on the town's main thoroughfare, Clover Street, the Whiskey Decanter Museum is built around a collection of some 2,000 ornamental decanters from the Jim Beam Distillery, collected by Charles and Betty Barrett of nearby Watertown, Tennessee. My information on the museum was kindly passed along to me by a listener, whiskey lover, and native Tennessean named Chase Steele, who informs me that, oddly enough, Mr. and Mrs. Barrett collected all those decanters, despite being teetotalers, who never touched a drop of whiskey in all their lives. Thinking about teetotalers, we can move on to the politics of whiskey, including late 19th century distinctions between bourbon Democrats and their populist opponents, many of whom went in for prohibitionism. If you're interested in that, we have a show in our archives where I interview Brendan J.J. Payne, author of a recent book called Gin, Jesus, and Jim Crow, about how whiskey politics spills over into broader Southern socio-cultural, economic, and political issues as we move from the 19th into the 20th centuries. But for now, I've gone on long enough. Talking about bourbon makes me want to go on and on, just as drinking it does. But before we end, there's still one thing about bourbon in the Southern mind we have to touch on. The weather. Perhaps above all else, bourbon puts Southerners, or maybe just me, in mind of the seasons we live through here in our place. How we drink our bourbon is tied directly to the seasons. Whiskey and ginger is the drink of Southern summers and autumn tailgates. The hot toddy, with just enough lemon, honey, and cloves, nurses us through winter's cold season. But Southern springs are where old bourbon whiskey shines most brilliantly. And y'all all know what I'm talking about. The julep. The mint julep. I end today with a poem I learned years ago from watching YouTube and seeing the greatest of Southern bartenders, New Orleans' Chris McMillan, make a mint julep while reciting this poem from memory. And thus I give you the very dream of drinks by the 19th century Kentucky colonel, lawyer, and newspaperman, Joshua Sule Smith. Then comes the zenith of man's pleasure. Then comes the julep, the mint julep. Who has not tasted one has lived in vain. The honey of Hymettus brought us no such solace to the soul. The nectar of the gods is tame beside it. It is the very dream of drinks, the vision of sweet quaffins. The bourbon and the mint are lovers. In the same land they live. On the same food they are fostered. The mint dips its infant leaves into the same stream that makes the bourbon what it is. The corn grows in the level lands through which the small streams meander. By the brookside the mint grows. As the little wavelets pass, they glide up to kiss the feet of the growing mint. The mint bends to salute them. Gracious and kind it is, living only for the sake of others. The crushing of it only makes its sweetness more apparent. Like a woman's heart, it gives its sweetest aroma when bruised. Among the first to greet the spring, it comes. Beside the gurgling brooks that make music in the pastures, it lives and thrives. When the bluegrass begins to shoot its gentle sprays toward the sun, mint comes, and its sweetest soul drinks at the crystal brook. It is virgin then, but soon it must be married to old Bourbon. His great heart, his warmth of temperament, and that affinity which no one understands, demand the wedding. How shall it be? Take from the cold spring some water, pure as angels are. Mix it with sugar until it seems like oil. Then take a glass and crush your mint within it with a spoon. Crush it around the borders of the glass and leave no place untouched. Then throw the mint away. It is a sacrifice. Fill with cracked ice in the glass. Pour in the quantity of bourbon which you want. It trickles slowly through the ice. Let it have time to cool, then pour your sugared water over it. No spoon is needed. No stirring is allowed. Just let it stand a moment. Then around the brim, place sprigs of mint, so that the one who drinks may find a taste and odor at one draught. When it is made, sip it slowly. August suns are shining. The breath of the south wind is upon you. It is fragrant, cold, and sweet. It is seductive. No maiden's touch could be more passionate. Sip it and dream. You cannot dream amiss. Sip it and dream. It is a dream itself. No other land can give so sweet a solace for your cares. No other liquor soothes you so in melancholy days. Sip it and say there is no solace for the soul, no tonic for the body, like old bourbon whiskey. I know for some of y'all, Smith's poem is perhaps a bit too maudlin. And so for those in the audience, I want to read to you very, very briefly from Walker Percy's 1975 essay called Bourbon, in which that great novelist notes that bourbon does for me what the piece of cake did for Proust. He then proceeds to list memories from 1926, 1933, 34, 35, and 41, and then fall back onto a brief meditation on bourbon in general. And he ends then with his recipe for the mint julep. So then, here goes Walker Percy. Reader, just in case you don't want to knock it back straight and would rather monkey around with perfectly good bourbon, here's my favorite recipe, Cudden Walker's Uncle Will's favorite mint julep receipt. You need excellent bourbon whiskey. Rye or Scotch will not do. Put half an inch of sugar in the bottom of the glass and merely dampen it with water. Next, very quickly, and here's the trick in the procedure, crush your ice. Actually powder it, preferably with a towel with a wooden mallet, so quickly that it remains dry, and slip in 2 sprigs of fresh mint against the inside of the glass. Cram the ice in right to the brim, packing it with your hand. Finally, fill the glass, which apparently has no room left for anything else, with bourbon, the older the better, and grate a bit of nutmeg on the top. The glass will frost immediately, then settle back in your chair for half an hour of cumulative bliss. I want to note that I would agree with Percy's recipe in just about everything, except you should use a metal julep cup, not a glass. I want to sign off with a question. How do you drink your bourbon? I'm a simple man and tend to like mine neat. But on a muggy Carolina summer night, I'll sometimes throw in a single ice cube, and in the cold, damp darkness of our winter, I may add a solitary sugar cube and a few dashes of orange and Angostura bitters to warm me from within. But let me know how you drink yours. digitalussouth@gmail.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Until again, this is Matt Simmons for Take on the South Southern Almanac, saying y'all take it easy.